The words hit Irene Bishop like a fist to the chest, and she stood in the middle of Arthur Keller's barn with the August heat pressing down on her like a judgment from God. "The harvest is already lost," Arthur said. He did not look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the cracked wooden slats of the barn floor, where the dry dust had settled in patterns that looked like the veins of a dying leaf. 3 weeks without rain. The wheat is gone, Irene. The corn is gone. I sent word to County Commissioner Hayes yesterday morning, and he agrees. There is nothing to be done." "You did what?" Irene's voice was quiet, which was worse than if she had screamed. Quiet meant she was thinking. Quiet meant the anger had gone somewhere deep and dangerous. "You contacted Hayes without telling me, without telling any of the families who depend on this land." Arthur finally looked up. He was a broad-shouldered man, 32 years old, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a winter sky gray shot through with cold blue. He had a jaw like a cliff face, and when he said it hard the way he was setting it now, most men in Colton County backed down without another word. Irene Bishop was not most men. She was not any kind of man at all. She was 28 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of pure prairie stubbornness, and she had been farming the Bishop family plot on the eastern edge of the Cimarron River Valley since her father's hands had stopped working 3 years ago. "I did what needed doing," Arthur said. "The railroad won't extend the credit. The bank in Guthrie is calling in notes. Hayes told me the territorial government has no drought relief funds left, not after what happened in the Panhandle last spring." "This is over, Irene. I know that is not what you want to hear." "You know nothing," she said, "about what I want to hear." She turned and walked out of that barn with her boots raising little puffs of pale dust, and the door swung behind her on its leather hinge, and Arthur Keller stood in the silence she left behind, feeling as though she had taken all the air in the territory with her. That confrontation was the end of something. It was also, though neither of them knew it yet, the absolute beginning of everything. To understand how Irene Bishop and Arthur Keller ended up facing each other across that barn floor in the scorching summer of 1893, you had to go back 8 months to the previous December, when the land in the Oklahoma Territory was still new and hopeful, and the settlers who had come in the land rush of 1889 were just beginning to understand what they had claimed. The Oklahoma Land Run had been the largest organized migration in the history of the American West. On a single afternoon in April of 1889, more than 50,000 people had lined up along the territorial border and raced for their chance at 160 acres of free land under the Homestead Act. Thomas Bishop, Irene's father, had been among them. He had ridden a brown quarter horse named General, and he had claimed a plot along the Cimarron River with a stand of cottonwood trees and 3 natural springs that the survey maps had not bothered to mark. Thomas Bishop had been a farmer in his bones. He had worked the land in Kansas before the grasshopper plagues of the 1870s had broken his family's finances, and he had come to Oklahoma with a daughter and a dream, and a wooden seed chest that had belonged to his own father. He had broken ground that first brutal winter with a hand plow and sheer determination, and by the spring of 1890, he had 12 acres of winter wheat in the ground and a small limestone house that he and Irene had built together stone by stone. Irene had been 25 when they made the run. She had not ridden beside her father purely out of filial devotion, though she loved Thomas Bishop with the fierce and uncomplicated love of someone who has never had reason to doubt it. She had ridden because she understood, in a way she had not yet found the words for, that the land was her future, not her father's future, her own. She had watched her mother die of fever in Kansas when Irene was 11, had watched her father's grief hollow him out, and then watched the prairie wind fill that hollow space with a quiet, purposeful dignity. Thomas Bishop was a man who processed sorrow through labor, and Irene had learned that from him the way children learn their first language without being taught it, simply by breathing the same air. By the summer of 1892, the Bishop farm was producing. Not producing abundantly, not producing in the fashion of the river-bottom farms further south, but producing enough. 40 acres of wheat and corn and sorghum. A kitchen garden that Irene tended with a precision that some of the neighboring men found amusing, until they tasted her winter squash and then did not find amusing at all. 3 milking cows, a small flock of chickens, and a mule named Theodore who was the most stubborn creature in the territory, and whom Irene loved for exactly that quality. Then the winter of 1892 came in hard and mean, and Thomas Bishop's hands stopped working. The doctor in Guthrie called it rheumatism, though the word felt inadequate for what Irene watched happen to her father's capable, calloused hands. They swelled and stiffened until he could not grip the plow handle, could not hold the reins, could not button his own shirt on the worst mornings. By February, he could do light work only, and by March even the light work cost him more than he was willing to admit. Irene did not slow down. She hired 2 day laborers from the settlement at Kingfisher when the spring planting needed doing, paying them with money she had saved from selling eggs and butter through the previous fall. She drove the team herself. She worked the fields from before sunrise until after the stars came out, and she was so focused on keeping the farm alive that she almost did not notice the new man who had taken up the harrow place 2 miles to the north. She noticed him at the general store in Colton, which was what most people called the small town that had grown up around the post office and the grain elevator and the Methodist church on the Cimarron Road. It was a Tuesday in early March of 1893, and Irene had come to collect a letter from her father's sister in Missouri and to purchase seed corn and lamp oil, and a box of the sulfur matches that Thomas had developed a requirement for since the arthritis had made it difficult for him to use a flint. Arthur Keller was standing at the counter, negotiating with old Mr. Prout about the price of fence wire when Irene came in. He was not what you would call a handsome man, not in the theatrical way of the men in the illustrated papers. He was large and plainly made, with working man's hands and a face that had been weathered to a kind of honesty. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a careful attention to the space around him, a stillness that made Irene glance at him twice before she turned to the mail slots. He noticed her noticing. She could tell from the slight shift in his posture, though he kept his eyes on Mr. Prout and his voice level and his negotiation going. Irene Bishop was not a woman who embarrassed easily, but she felt heat in her face that she could not attribute to the warmth of the store. She collected her letter, found her seed corn, and was settling up her account at the counter when Arthur Keller turned from his completed transaction and nearly walked directly into her. "Pardon me," he said. He stepped back with that careful quality she had already noticed. Up close his eyes were striking that complex gray-blue, very direct, the kind of eyes that gave the impression of saying more than the mouth was currently saying. "No harm," Irene said. "You are the one who took the Harrow place." "Arthur Keller," he said, and he removed his hat with a formality that was not stiff but simply respectful, the kind of manners that came from genuine regard rather than performance. "Yes, I am. I came down from Kansas. Irene Bishop. The Bishop farm is 2 miles south along the creek." "I know it," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he had noticed more than just a farm marker. "Your winter wheat looked well when I passed it last week." "It is tolerably well," Irene said. This was something of an understatement. Her winter wheat was the best stand for several miles, and she knew it, but she did not see any advantage in boasting to a man she had just met. "Your father farms with you." "My father farms with his advice and considerable wisdom," Irene said, and the dryness in her voice made Arthur Keller's mouth do something that was almost a smile. "His hands have taken sick. I manage the field work." He looked at her then with a directness that might have been rude if it had been anything other than what it was, which was plain, undefended assessment. "That is a hard position," he said. "Most positions worth holding are," Irene said. She picked up her purchases and walked out of Prout's general store, and Arthur Keller watched her go, and something in him that had been quietly dormant for several years began, without his permission, to wake up. He came to the Bishop farm 3 days later, with a completely practical reason. He had a question about the creek's tendency to flood in spring, which Thomas Bishop, with his 4 years of experience on the land, would be better positioned to answer than any other neighbor. He had not invented the question. He genuinely needed to know. But he could have asked the question at the store on any given Tuesday, and instead he found himself riding south along the creek track on a Thursday afternoon, when the sky was the particular blue that only appears in early spring when winter has finally conceded the field. Irene was in the kitchen garden when he arrived. She had her skirts pinned up above her boot tops and her sleeves rolled past her elbows, and she was turning soil with a long-handled fork, and she looked up when she heard his horse without any of the self-consciousness that some women might have shown at being seen in such a state. She was not self-conscious about working. She had never learned to be. "Mr. Keller," she said. "Miss Bishop, I apologize for coming without sending word. Is your father available? He is inside. Come in and have coffee if you want it, and I will finish this row and be in directly." She did not offer him the invitation with any particular warmth, but there was nothing unfriendly in it either. It was simply efficient. She had more row to finish. She would be in when the row was finished. These were facts arranged in their proper order. Thomas Bishop received Arthur Keller in the small front room of the limestone house with the cautious courtesy of a man who has learned to take the measure of strangers carefully. He was 60 years old and gray-haired, with the kind of steady eyes that Irene had clearly inherited, and his swollen hands lay in his lap with a stillness that Arthur recognized as controlled pain rather than ease. They talked about the creek, and about the drainage patterns, and about the soil composition that Thomas had learned through 4 years of intimate failure and success. And Thomas Bishop was generous with his knowledge in the way that farmers often are with other farmers, because the land teaches everyone eventually, and there is no point in withholding what it has taught you. Irene came in from the garden and washed her hands at the basin and poured coffee without being asked, and she sat at the table with them and listened. And occasionally she said something that was so precisely accurate that both men looked at her and registered the same thought, which was that this woman knew this land the way most people knew their own names. Arthur Keller rode home that evening thinking about the clean line of Irene Bishop's profile when she was concentrating on something being said, and he caught himself thinking about it and made a deliberate effort to think instead about his fence wire situation, and then found himself thinking about her again before he had reached his own gate. He came back the following week on another perfectly reasonable errand. Then the week after that, on an errand that was slightly less perfectly reasonable. By April he had become a regular presence at the Bishop farm, and Thomas Bishop watched the growing pattern with the expression of a man who is watching something pleasant and inevitable unfold, and he said nothing about it to Irene, because Thomas Bishop was smart enough to know that saying nothing was frequently the most powerful thing a father could do. Irene was not unaware of what was happening. She was 28 years old and had lived in close proximity to men and women her entire life, and she understood the language of attention. She understood that Arthur Keller was not coming to her farm repeatedly for the sake of her father's agricultural knowledge, though he genuinely valued that knowledge. She understood that something was building between them. What she was not sure about was what she intended to do about it. She had not been without suitors. There had been a man in Kansas before the run, a schoolteacher named Philip who had been gentle and kind and hopelessly unsuited for the life she wanted. There had been a farmer in the Kingfisher settlement who had asked her father's permission to court her, and Thomas had told him he would need to ask Irene directly. And when the man had come to her, she had looked at him and felt nothing particular and had told him, with more kindness than he perhaps deserved, that she did not think they would suit. Arthur Keller was different, and the difference was specific. He did not look at her with the vague, romantic generosity that some men used as a substitute for actually seeing the person in front of them. He looked at her as though he was genuinely interested in understanding her, which was both flattering and, in ways she could not immediately articulate, a little frightening. Being truly seen by another person required trusting them not to use what they saw against you. She had a dark past with trust, not dramatic darkness, not the kind that made for entertaining stories. Simply the quiet darkness of a woman who had watched the world repeatedly tell her that her ideas, her capabilities, and her judgment were provisional valid only, until a man in the vicinity decided they were not. She had learned to protect herself against that particular kind of betrayal with the most efficient tool available to her, which was self-sufficiency. And yet, in May of 1893, Arthur Keller came to the Bishop farm on a Sunday afternoon, and Irene was sitting on the porch reading a 2-week-old copy of the Kansas City Star. And instead of going inside to speak with her father, he came and sat in the other porch chair, without asking permission, in a way that was not presumptuous but simply natural, as though the chair had been waiting for him. And Irene went on reading her newspaper, and Arthur sat in companionable silence watching the cottonwood trees move in the warm wind. And after about 20 minutes Irene said, "The railroad is raising freight rates again." "I heard," Arthur said. "It will hurt the small farms worst. The big operators can absorb it. The men with 40 acres cannot. Do you have a suggestion?" She looked at him over the edge of the paper. The question had been direct and sincere, without even a trace of the patronizing quality that might have crept in, the tone that implied the answer would be entertaining at most. He wanted to know her actual thought. "The farmers need to negotiate collectively," she said, "not as individuals. If every small farmer in Colton County sent their grain through a single cooperative elevator, they would have the volume to push back on the railroad rates." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "That is not a simple thing to organize," he said. "No," Irene agreed. "It is not simple. Simple things generally are not worth organizing." That made him laugh, and it was a good laugh, uncalculated and warm, and Irene felt it land somewhere near the center of her chest in a way that she subsequently spent 2 days trying to analyze, and eventually gave up on analyzing and simply acknowledged. She was in danger of being in love with Arthur Keller, and the recognition of this fact frightened her in direct proportion to how certain she was of it. The spring moved forward into summer, and summer was beautiful in the way that Oklahoma summers sometimes are in their early weeks, warm but not cruel, with afternoon thunderstorms that kept the soil moist and the crops growing. Irene's wheat looked magnificent by June. Arthur's corn was knee-high by the 4th of July, when the settlement at Colton held its celebration with a fiddle player from Guthrie and a pie contest that Irene won with a sour cherry pie that left several men briefly speechless. Arthur tasted her pie and looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, his expression was completely unguarded, and Irene saw something in it that made her look away, because looking at it directly felt too much like looking at the sun. They walked together along the Cimarron after the celebration, when the light was long and golden, and the cicadas were beginning their evening performance. They were not alone. Precisely, Thomas Bishop was 50 yards behind them, moving at the careful pace his hands required, but they were far enough ahead to have conversation that was effectively private. "You have been farming since you were a girl," Arthur said. "It was not a question." "Since I was 8, Irene said. "Before that I was too small to be useful, but I tried anyway and my father let me. He is a good man." "He is the best man I know," Irene said simply. "He always let me try." He never suggested that the trying was itself inappropriate, the way some fathers would have. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father was not like that." The statement hung in the warm evening air. Irene waited. "He had strong ideas about what work was and who should do it," Arthur said carefully. "He was not cruel. He simply could not imagine that the categories he believed in might not be universal. That is a gentle way to say it. It is the accurate way." He looked out at the river, which was moving slow and golden in the late light. "He died 4 years ago. My mother is in Kansas with my sister. I came here because I needed land that was mine without the weight of what someone else thought I should do with it." Irene understood this more completely than she could say. "I came here because the land was real," she said. "In Kansas, it felt like we were always one bad season away from losing everything. Here, at least we started from nothing and made something, so the something is ours in a way it never was before." He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and the light was doing remarkable things to his face, softening the rough angles, and his eyes were warm in a way that the cold gray blue of them did not usually suggest. "Irene," he said, and there was a weight in her name that he had never put there before. "Yes," she said, and her heart was doing something alarming. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "with your father's knowledge and your own permission. Not just because I have reasons to discuss farming matters, but because—" He stopped. He seemed to be measuring his words with unusual care. "Because I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in this territory, and possibly anywhere, and I would like the opportunity to demonstrate that I understand the difference between admiring someone and respecting them." The distinction he made stopped her. He had not said he wanted to court her in the manner of a man who has decided he wants something and is announcing it. He had said he wanted to demonstrate understanding. He had acknowledged, without making a production of it, that admiration and respect were different things, and that he knew which one mattered. Irene Bishop, who had spent 28 years learning to protect the territory around her heart, felt the wall she had built there develop a very specific crack. "You may call on me properly," she said. "I will speak to my father tonight." Thomas Bishop, when consulted, said simply, "I had wondered when you would come to this conclusion," which was the kind of thing fathers say that are simultaneously maddening and deeply comforting. July passed in a state of sweet tension, and in July the rain stopped. It was not uncommon for the Oklahoma Territory to have dry spells in midsummer. The land was plains country, given to extremes in both directions, and experienced farmers knew to plant with the dry weeks in mind. But this dry spell did not behave like a normal August lull. It extended backward into July and forward into August, and each day the sky remained blisteringly clear, and the soil cracked a little more deeply, and the wheat began to show distress in the way wheat shows distress, which is quietly and then all at once. By the middle of August, the situation was serious. Irene walked her fields every morning and evening, doing the kind of detailed observation that most people would have called worrying, but that she understood as information gathering. The information she gathered was not encouraging. The wheat was not entirely lost, not yet, but it was suffering, and the corn was worse than the wheat, and the sorghum, which was supposed to be the most drought-tolerant of the three, was struggling in ways that told her the water table beneath her fields had dropped more than she had calculated. She was not the only one in this position. The families throughout Colton County and into the neighboring counties of Logan and Kingfisher were watching the same disaster unfold in their own fields. The Hendersons to her west had lost their entire corn crop already. The Petrakis family on the south side of the creek had begun slaughtering cattle they could not afford to feed, at prices that would not begin to cover their losses. It was in this context that Arthur Keller came to her and said the harvest was already lost. She understood why he said it. She had seen his fields, and they were worse than hers, because his soil had more clay content and held moisture less efficiently, and the drought had hit the northern part of the valley harder than the southern end where the Bishop farm sat. She understood that Arthur Keller was not a weak man, and that when he said the harvest was already lost, he was not giving up from cowardice, but from a reading of the evidence that was, in isolation, not entirely unreasonable. But Irene Bishop did not make decisions in isolation. She made them in context, which was a very different thing. She walked home from Arthur's barn in the blazing August heat with the dust rising around her boots and her mind moving faster than her feet. She was angry, but the anger was not simple. It was not anger at Arthur for being wrong, though she believed he was wrong. It was anger at the situation that had made him feel that despair was the only rational response, and beneath that, in a place she would not examine directly for several more days, It was anger that had a hidden motive she recognized and did not like recognizing, the fear that she had been in the process of trusting a man who, when the crisis came, chose surrender. She pushed that fear aside. She had work to do. She sat at her kitchen table that evening and wrote 7 letters. She wrote to Helen McDonald in Logan County, who ran the Logan County Women's Farmers Cooperative, and had the kind of organizational energy that could move mountains if you pointed her at the right mountain. She wrote to George Petrakis, who was Greek-born and spoke 4 languages, and had relationships with every farmer on the South Creek, regardless of their background or origin. She wrote to James Whitehorse, a Cherokee man who had been farming the eastern edge of the territory since before the land run, and who understood the land's water patterns better than anyone Irene knew, because his people had lived on it for generations while everyone else was still learning to read it. She wrote to the Reverend Caldwell at the Methodist Church in Colton, because Reverend Caldwell had standing with the county commission that no farmer had independently. She wrote to Margaret Prout, Mr. Prout's daughter-in-law, who was the most efficient gossip in 3 counties, which was not an insult, but rather an acknowledgement that information flowed through Margaret Prout like water through good soil. She wrote to the editor of the Guthrie Daily Leader, and she wrote to County Commissioner Hayes directly, without going through Arthur Keller or any other intermediary. She sealed each letter with beeswax, addressed each in her careful, clear hand, and left them on the table to go out with the morning post. Then she went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours thinking about Arthur Keller's face in the barn, and the particular quality of the defeat she had seen there, and the way her heart had contracted at the sight of it even as she was preparing to contradict everything he had said. She fell asleep resolving to think about her heart later. Right now, she had 3 counties to organize. The response to her letters was faster than she expected, which told her that she was not the only one who had been waiting for someone to act. Helen McDonald wrote back within 4 days with a list of 47 farm families in Logan County who were in varying stages of crisis and who needed coordination, not charity. George Petrakis showed up at her door 3 days after that without waiting for correspondence at all, having heard from the Hendersons that Irene Bishop was doing something, and he came with his eldest son and a handshake that was more binding than most written contracts. James Whitehorse came on a Tuesday, riding a sorrel horse and carrying himself with the quiet dignity that Irene had learned to recognize as the mark of someone who has been required to maintain their dignity against significant opposition. He was 55 years old with deep-set dark eyes and the bearing of a man who has been thinking about land and water and survival long enough to have developed strong opinions about all 3. He and Irene sat on her porch for 2 hours, and she asked questions and he answered them, and the answers were not comfortable but they were true, which was what she needed. "The aquifer beneath your section runs north to south," James Whitehorse said. "There is a layer of limestone at about 40 feet that holds water even in dry years. Your neighbors to the north are drawing from the surface wells, which have run dry, but if you drill to the limestone, there is water. How certain are you?" Irene asked. "Certain enough that my family drilled there 30 years ago," he said. "The well is still there, on land your government has since decided belongs to someone else." Irene felt the weight of that statement settle on her shoulders, and she let it settle rather than looking away from it. "I am sorry for that," she said, and she meant it in the full and uncomfortable sense of the word, not as a social formula but as genuine accountability for something she had benefited from and could not undo. He looked at her steadily. "Your sorrow does not fix it," he said, "but it is more honest than what most people offer." They talked for another hour about where the limestone aquifer ran and which farms in the eastern portion of the county might reach it with a standard drilling rig, and by the time James Whitehorse rode away, Irene had the core of a practical plan. The plan required 3 things: drilling rigs, coordination, and the suspension of the county bank's intention to call in loans during the crisis period. The drilling rigs were the most immediate problem. There were 2 in the territory, both owned by commercial operations, and renting them would cost more than any individual farm could manage. But if 20 farms pooled the cost, the math changed entirely. Irene organized the meeting at the Colton Methodist Church on the 15th of August. She wrote to every farm family within 20 miles and asked them to come. She asked Reverend Caldwell to open the church and chair the meeting, because a reverend chairing a farmers' meeting was slightly less likely to alarm the county commissioners than a 28-year-old woman doing the same thing. And Irene was practical enough about the injustice of this to use it as a tool rather than simply being angry about it. 63 families showed up. Irene had not told Arthur Keller about any of this. She had started not telling him in the heat of her anger, and then continued not telling him as the work consumed her days, and then began avoiding the question of whether to tell him, because the answer was complicated in ways she did not yet have the emotional resources to face. She was still angry. She was angry in the specific, precise way of someone who has been told something is impossible and suspects, without yet being certain, that they have been told this by someone who had a hidden motive for believing it. She was not being entirely fair to Arthur. She knew she was not being entirely fair to Arthur. But she could not untangle her feelings from her actions fast enough to address both at the same time, and the actions were more urgent. She did not see him at the meeting. She had not expected to see him at the meeting, but she was aware of his absence in the way you are aware of a missing tooth, not constantly, but every time your tongue moves across the space where it should be. The meeting was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Irene stood at the front of the Methodist Church with 63 farm families looking at her men, women, several families with Cherokee ancestry who had pre-run claims on the land, 2 families who had come from Germany and whose English was functional but careful, the Petrakis family, the Hendersons, the McDonalds, who had driven 3 hours from Logan County, and a dozen other families whose faces she recognized from 4 years of shared commerce and crisis and the small daily business of neighboring. She was nervous. She had never spoken before a group this large. But she had a plan, and the plan was sound, and she had learned from her father that the antidote to nervousness was precision. "You have all received my letter," she began. "I will not repeat what I wrote in it. Instead, I will tell you what I have learned in the past 2 weeks that I did not know when I wrote it." She laid out the information about the limestone aquifer in clear, methodical language, citing James Whitehorse as her source with the directness of someone who understands that the source's credibility matters, and that James Whitehorse had been watching this land longer than anyone in the room. She heard a murmur when she named him, and she waited for the murmur to subside and then continued as though it had not happened, which was the most effective way to handle it. She explained the cost calculation for drilling. She explained the cooperative structure she was proposing, in which every participating family contributed proportionally to the cost based on their acreage and received proportional access to the water. She explained the timeline, which was tight but achievable if they began immediately. She explained what she had written to Commissioner Hayes and what she intended to write to the territorial legislature if Hayes was unhelpful. When she finished, there was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds, and then George Petracki stood up and said, "I am in a voice that carried to the back of the church, and the silence broke into something else, which was the specific sound of 63 families beginning to believe that the harvest was not already lost. The negotiation that followed was long and occasionally contentious. There were men who doubted the geology. There were men who had never participated in a cooperative structure and were uncertain of the legal implications. There were 2 families who could not afford even their proportional share of the drilling cost, and this required a separate conversation that resulted in those families contributing labor rather than money, which solved the problem without leaving anyone behind. Helen McDonald, who had driven 3 hours, turned out to be the most effective voice in the room for the reluctant, and Irene watched her work the skeptics with a combination of directness and humor that she filed away for future reference. By the end of the evening, They had a signed agreement from 41 families, which was more than enough to make the economics work. They had a committee of 7, including Irene and Helen and George Petrakis and Reverend Caldwell, authorized to negotiate with the drilling company and with Commissioner Hayes and with the bank in Guthrie. They had a meeting date 2 weeks hence to report progress. Irene drove home in the dark with her father beside her on the wagon seat, and Thomas Bishop sat in silence for most of the journey, and then he said, "Your grandfather would have been proud of you tonight." Irene felt tears behind her eyes in a way she rarely permitted herself, and she blinked them away and kept her hands steady on the reins. "I hope it works," she said. "So do I," Thomas said. "Even if it didn't, you gave 63 families a better option than sitting at home and waiting to lose everything. That matters regardless of what happens with the water." She thought about that for the rest of the drive home, and she thought about Arthur Keller, and she thought about betrayal and hidden motives, and the trap of surrendering to despair before the battle was actually over, and she thought about the way he had looked at her in the barn and the defeat in his eyes, and she thought about how she had walked away. In the morning she wrote him a letter. It was not a warm letter. She was not ready to write a warm letter. But it was honest, which she thought he deserved, and honest was harder than warm in the specific circumstances she was navigating. She wrote, "I have been organizing the farmers of 3 counties around the water problem, as I believe the harvest is recoverable if we act immediately. There is a meeting of the committee tomorrow at the church. If you are willing to hear the plan before you make your final judgment about whether the situation is hopeless, you are welcome to come. I would not have you excluded from something that affects your farm as much as anyone's. I would also speak with you privately, when you are ready, about some things that have been left between us in a way that I find unsatisfactory. Irene Bishop." She sealed it and sent it with the morning mail and spent the rest of the day working and trying not to think about whether he would come. He came. He arrived at the church 20 minutes before the committee meeting was scheduled to begin, and Irene was already there arranging the chairs with Helen MacDonald. She heard him at the door and did not turn immediately. She finished placing the last chair and then she turned, and he was standing in the doorway of the church with his hat in his hands, and his expression doing something complicated that she could not immediately read. "You came," she said. "I came," he agreed. He looked at the arranged chairs, at Helen MacDonald, who was regarding him with the frank assessment of a woman who has already formed a preliminary opinion, at the papers spread on the table that Reverend Caldwell used as a desk. "You have been busy." "You told me the harvest was already lost," Irene said. "I disagreed." He was quiet for a moment. "I read your letter 4 times, he said. "It was not a complicated letter." "No," he said. "It was a very clear letter. That is why I read it 4 times. He stepped fully into the church and set his hat on a chair. "Irene, I owe you an apology." "You owe me an explanation first," she said. "The apology can wait." He looked at her steadily, and the gray-blue eyes were doing the thing they did when he was organizing his thoughts into honest order. "I have been through a failed harvest before," he said. "In Kansas in 1887, we lost everything. The whole farm, the house, everything my family had built over 8 years. My father never recovered from it, not financially and not," he paused, "not in any other way. When I saw the drought conditions developing here, I felt it the way you feel something you have already survived once, like a darkness you recognize." Helen MacDonald had stepped discreetly to the far end of the room and was studying a Bible verse embroidered on the wall with great apparent interest. "I understand that," Irene said, and she did understand it. She understood the darkness of a past loss that shapes your perception of present possibility. She had her own version of that darkness. "But you made a decision without bringing it to me, without bringing it to any of us. You went to Hayes alone." "I did," he said, "and that was wrong. Not because going to Hayes was wrong in itself, but because I went with surrender already in my hands rather than coming to you first. I should have come to you first." The acknowledgement was so straightforward, so entirely without deflection, that Irene felt something in her chest shift. "You believed it was already over," she said, "and I was furious at you for believing it. But I also—" She stopped. She was not a woman who left sentences unfinished, but this one required more courage than most. "I was frightened," she said. "That you might be right, that is part of why I was so angry." Arthur Keller looked at her with the complete attention he always gave when something important was being said, and she saw in his face something she had not expected to see there, which was relief, as though her admission of fear was not a weakness that diminished her but a door that he had been waiting for permission to walk through. "The plan," he said after a moment. "Tell me the plan." She told him. She laid it out with the same precision she had used at the larger meeting, and he listened with the attentive quality that was one of the first things she had noticed about him, asking clear questions when he had them, not asking questions for the sake of appearing interested. He was genuinely interested, she could tell the difference. When she finished, he was quiet for perhaps 30 seconds, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a thinking silence. "The geology is sound," he said finally. "I know that limestone aquifer. I struck the edge of it when I was digging my north fence posts and the ground changed at about 38 feet. He looked at her. "I should have thought of it myself." "You were too close to the despair to think clearly," Irene said. "That is what despair does. It is not a character flaw, it is a weather condition." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is a generous interpretation," he said. "It is the accurate one," she said. And then, because she had run out of careful distance and could not maintain it any more without dishonesty, "Arthur, I need you to know that when I walked out of your barn, I was not walking away from you. I was walking toward a solution. There is a difference." "I know," he said. "I know it now. I did not know it that afternoon, and it was the loneliest I have been in a long time." Helen MacDonald chose this precise moment to turn from the Bible embroidery and say, brightly, to no one in particular, "I believe the others will be arriving shortly. Perhaps we should prepare the table." The committee meeting went efficiently. Arthur sat with them and contributed specific technical knowledge about the north end of the valley that filled in a gap in Irene's analysis. And the dynamic in the room was one of people who are working toward a concrete goal rather than people who are performing work, which is a meaningful distinction. Afterward, as the others filed out, Arthur held the church door for Irene and then fell into step beside her in the warm afternoon, and they walked slowly toward where their horses were tied, and he said, "May I ask what happened with Commissioner Hayes?" "Hayes was unhelpful," Irene said. "He said the territorial government had no relief funds, which is true, and he said the drought was a private matter, which is not true in any meaningful sense, and he said women's organizations had no official standing to petition the county commission, which I found interesting because I don't recall the petition being titled as a women's organization." Arthur's mouth did that thing again, the almost smile. "What did you say to him?" "I said that 41 families in 3 counties had signed a cooperative agreement, that the cooperative was a legal entity under the territorial business statutes, that the legal entity's petition would be filed regardless of his opinion on the matter, and that I would be in touch with the Guthrie Daily Leader editor about the county commission's response to a drought crisis affecting 300 farming families." She paused. "Hayes became more helpful after that." Arthur stopped walking and turned to look at her fully. The afternoon sun was behind her and it made a complicated pattern in her dark hair, and his expression was one she had seen only fragments of before but that she now saw completely, openly, without reservation, and it was the expression of a man who is entirely, helplessly, and without his original intention in love. "Irene," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to say it properly." "You may say it," she said. "I love you," Arthur Keller said, in the straightforward and honest manner in which he did everything. "I have been trying not to say it for 4 months because I could not determine whether you wanted to hear it, and I did not want to say it in a way that felt like pressure. But I think you do want to hear it, and I think you might say something back that I very much want to hear." Irene Bishop looked at this man who had told her the harvest was already lost, and whom she had proceeded to prove wrong through the combined effort of 3 counties and her own iron-willed stubbornness. and she looked at the way he had come to that church meeting and listened and learned and apologized without qualification. And she looked at the gray-blue eyes that were looking at her with more honest feeling than she had ever seen in anyone's eyes directed toward her, and she said, "I love you, Arthur. I have been furious at you and frightened and more organized than I have ever been in my life, and through all of it I have been hopelessly in love with you, which was honestly inconvenient given the circumstances." He laughed, the good warm laugh that she had first heard on her porch. And then he reached out and took her hand, and the touch was careful and deliberate in the way all his movements were careful and deliberate, and it was the simplest thing and also the most significant thing that had happened to Irene Bishop in 28 years of living. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "we drill the wells." The drilling operation began 12 days later. The company they had contracted with Harmon and Sons Drilling, based in Guthrie, sent 2 rigs with full crews, and the work began on the Henderson farm because the Hendersons were in the worst position, and because starting with the worst positioned family meant the moral order of the thing was clear from the beginning. If the water was there, the Hendersons would know first. If it was not, the Hendersons needed to know that first too, so they could make other plans. The water was there. At 39 feet on the Henderson property, the drill broke through limestone into the aquifer, and water rose in the casing with a pressure that made the drilling foreman raise his eyebrows and say to Irene, "Ma'am, wherever you got your information, it was good information." "I got it from someone who has been watching this land for 50 years, Irene said. She sent a rider to James Whitehorse immediately. She had promised him she would. He came the following morning and stood beside the Henderson well casing in the early light and looked down at the water 12 feet below the surface and said something quiet in Cherokee that Irene did not understand and did not ask to have translated, because some things are not meant for translation. Then he looked at her and said, "I am glad this water is being used." "So am I," Irene said. "I am sorry it took this particular crisis to find it." "Crises find water," he said. "That is what they are for." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The drilling moved systematically through the eastern farms over the following 3 weeks. Of the 41 families who had signed the cooperative agreement, 38 had land over or adjacent to the limestone aquifer, and all 38 struck water at depths between 35 and 45 feet. The 3 families whose land lay too far west of the aquifer's path were accommodated through pipeline arrangements with adjacent farms, a solution that required additional coordination, but that everyone involved managed with the pragmatic generosity of people who understand that they are all in the same geography. The water did not save every crop entirely. The wheat was as compromised as it was ever going to be. 3 weeks without water at the critical development stage left marks that well drilling could not undo. But the corn and sorghum responded to the emergency irrigation with a rapidity that surprised even the optimists on the committee, and by mid-September the fields that had been brown and dying were showing the specific green color of recovery, which is a slightly more saturated, slightly more determined shade than the original growth. And the wheat, which Arthur had stood in his barn and declared lost, partially recovered, not to what it would have been, not to the magnificent stand that June had promised, but enough. Enough to pay the bank notes, enough to keep the land, enough to mean that the forced choice between survival and surrender did not, in the end, have to be made. Commissioner Hayes attended the September committee meeting and delivered what was possibly the most uncomfortable congratulations in the history of the Oklahoma Territory. He also presented a letter from the territorial governor, acknowledging the Colton County Farmers Cooperative as a legal entity in good standing, and recommending it as a model for similar drought response in other counties. Irene accepted the letter with the particular kind of courtesy that is not quite the same as warmth, but leaves no opening for offense, and Hayes left before the refreshments were served. Helen McDonald cornered Irene near the pie table. There was always a pie table at these events, because the women of the Oklahoma Territory understood the strategic value of food at a business meeting and said, in the direct way that Irene had come to treasure about her, "Your Mr. Keller has been watching you from across the room for the past hour with an expression that would make a stone feel loved." Irene did not look across the room. "He is not my Mr. Keller," she said. Helen gave her a look of such profound skepticism that it qualified as an argument. "Are you certain about that?" Irene picked up a piece of pie and took a bite and looked at the wall and said, "I am working on it." "Work faster," Helen said. Irene laughed, and it was a surprised, fully genuine laugh that carried across the room. And across the room Arthur Keller heard it and thought it was the most complete sound he had ever encountered. October came, and the harvest came with it. It was not the harvest of the good year stories that farmers tell in the winter to remind themselves what the land can do when everything aligns. But it was a harvest. Real grain in real wagons, moving to the elevator at Colton, and the prices that the cooperative negotiated for the combined grain were better than any individual farm could have achieved alone, because volume changes the arithmetic of everything. The Bishop farm harvested 1,400 bushels of wheat, which was 60% of what it should have been and 100% more than what Arthur Keller had said was coming when he stood in his barn in August and told her it was already over. Irene stood at the edge of her harvested field on a Saturday afternoon in late October and felt the particular satisfaction that comes not from having been right, but from having refused to accept a reality that she believed was changeable. There is a specific pride in that, different from the pride of natural success, sharper and more honest because it was purchased with work and organization, and the willingness to be wrong about something that later turned out to be right. Arthur found her there. He had a way of finding her without being directed to her location, which she had noticed and which she thought about occasionally with the warm, slightly dizzying feeling of someone who is being consistently thought about by someone she consistently thinks about. He stood beside her and looked at the field, and then he said, "I was wrong." "Yes," she said, "you were. You were right." "Yes," she said, "I was." He looked at the field for another moment. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I said in the barn. The way I said it, going to Hayes without coming to you first, the whole sequence of it, and I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "The hidden motive," he said, and the words were careful and deliberate in his way, "in my surrender was not just the memory of Kansas. It was," he stopped, started again. "I had been trying to decide for several months whether to ask you something important, and when the drought came and the crops failed, I told myself it was Providence, that I should not ask someone to take on a future that was already in jeopardy, that it was kinder to acknowledge the failure first and then step back." Irene turned to look at him fully. The October light was softer than August's fire, more golden than brutal, and it did something very kind to the lines of his face. "You were using the drought as a reason not to speak," she said. "I was," he said, "which was cowardly. You would have told me that clearly if you had known it." "I am telling you now," she said. He turned to face her and reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something, and it was small and caught the light in a way that made Irene's heart stop for a brief, complete moment. It was a ring, not elaborate. The gold band was plain, and the stone was a small garnet, dark red, and it was clearly the ring of someone who had purchased it with whatever resources were available, and without the inclination to apologize for their limits. "I bought this in September," he said, "when I knew the harvest was coming in, when I knew you had been right and I had been wrong and the land was going to survive and we were going to be all right. I have been carrying it for 6 weeks trying to find the right moment, which I suspect is another form of cowardice." Irene looked at the ring and then at his face and then at the ring again. "It belonged to my mother originally," he said, "until she gave it to my sister, who returned it to me when I came to Oklahoma because she said the stone matched my eyes." Irene looked at the garnet and then at his eyes, and they did not match, because his eyes were gray-blue and the garnet was dark red, but she understood what his sister had meant, which was that the ring was the color of something deep and persistent. "Irene Bishop," Arthur Keller said, and he was not kneeling, which she approved of because she had always found the gesture theatrical, and he was simply standing beside her in her harvested field looking at her with the full and direct attention that she had come to understand as the most honest expression of who he was. "Will you marry me? Not because the harvest came in, not because everything worked out, but because I cannot imagine any version of my future, prosperous or devastated, that I would want to navigate without you in it." Irene Bishop, who had organized 3 counties and proved otherwise when everyone said it was impossible, who had written 7 letters and attended 6 meetings, and negotiated with drilling companies and county commissioners and stubborn farming families, who had been furious and frightened and more capable than anyone in the room usually expected, felt something in her chest open up completely, like a field after rain. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Arthur, I will marry you." He slid the garnet ring onto her finger and it fit as though it had been made for it, and the October light was warm and golden around them, and he took her face in his hands with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and kissed her for the first time in her harvested field, and it was a good kiss, honest and warm and exactly right. Thomas Bishop, who was sitting on the porch a quarter-mile away and had watched the two of them walk to the edge of the field, said quietly to himself, "About time," and went inside to put the kettle on. They married in November at the Methodist Church in Colton, with 63 farm families from 3 counties in attendance, because by that point the Colton County Farmers Cooperative had become a community institution, and Irene Bishop Keller was its founding organizer, and people showed up. Helen McDonald rode 3 hours from Logan County in a wagon with her husband, and brought a quilt that she had made in the intervening weeks, stitched in the pattern called Flying Geese, which she said was appropriate for a woman who refused to stay grounded when circumstances called for flight. The reverend who married them was Reverend Caldwell, who had been part of the committee since the beginning, and who delivered a ceremony that was brief and warm, and contained a specific line about the dignity of shared labor that made Thomas Bishop press his swollen hands together and look at the ceiling for a moment. Irene wore her mother's ivory dress, which she had kept folded in cedar at the bottom of her trunk for 8 years, and she had let it out at the waist and taken it in at the hem, and it fit her the way a thing fits when it was made for a purpose and has finally arrived at it. Arthur stood beside her in his best dark coat, which he had pressed in Guthrie specifically for the occasion, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with her father's hand on her arm, and the expression on his face was the same unguarded, undefended thing she had seen fragments of in the July light by the river, now fully present and unashamed. James Whitehorse attended the ceremony, sitting near the back with his daughter, and Irene had made certain that his name was acknowledged in the toasts at the reception that followed, because the harvest would not have been saved without the knowledge he had shared, and Irene Bishop Keller was not a woman who allowed debts of gratitude to remain unnamed. They moved into Arthur's farmhouse after the wedding, which was larger than the Bishop limestone house and had a better stove, and they made adjustments and negotiations about the space, with the pragmatic mutual accommodation of 2 people who have spent their lives being independent and are now discovering that sharing requires a specific kind of trust they are willing to extend. Thomas Bishop stayed in the limestone house because he wanted to and because the springs on the Bishop property were good in winter, and he had his patterns and his routines, and he was 60 years old and not about to give them up. But he had dinner with them 3 times a week, and Irene checked on him every morning, and the arrangement worked because it was honest. The winter of 1893 was cold but not brutal, and Irene and Arthur spent it in the close partnership of 2 people who have a great deal of ground to cover, practical ground, the planning of the next year's planting, the cooperative's expansion into Logan County, which Helen McDonald was organizing, but also the personal ground of 2 lives being gradually understood by each other. Irene told Arthur about Kansas and her mother's death and the grasshopper plagues. Arthur told her about his father's rigidity and the failure of the family farm in 1887, and the years he had spent in between, drifting and working as a hired hand, and not being sure what he was working toward. He told her about the secret he had kept from her in August, not just the ring but the full extent of his terror, which was not that the harvest would fail but that she would see his failure and find him wanting. "That is the trap," Irene said, listening to this. "The belief that being in difficulty makes you less worthwhile. Your father taught you that. The world confirmed it, but it is not true." "I know that now," he said. "You knew it before," she said. "You just couldn't feel it yet." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight of their first winter together, and something in the look was grateful in a way that was bigger than the word usually contains. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Say the exact thing that is true." "I practice," she said simply. "I have been practicing my whole life." The spring planting of 1894 was the most organized operation the Keller Bishop farm had ever undertaken, which was saying something given Irene's existing tendency toward organization. They broke ground on an additional 20 acres, rotating the crop selection based on James Whitehorse's advice about what the soil composition on the north end could sustain, and they had the cooperative well providing reliable irrigation from the limestone aquifer, and the winter wheat went in with the kind of confident precision that comes from having survived the previous year's crisis and learned from it. In April, Irene knew she was carrying a child. She told Arthur on a Thursday evening when he came in from the field and she had dinner on the table, and she said, without preamble, because preamble was not her style, "We are going to have a baby in October." Arthur Keller, who was not a man of dramatic physical expression, sat down in his chair slowly and stared at his wife with an expression of such pure, unmediated joy that Irene felt her throat tighten. "October," he said. "Give or take," she said. "Dr. Harrison in Guthrie thinks perhaps the 20th." Arthur reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and his hand was warm and rough, and the hand she had come to know the way she knew her own fields intimately, with complete confidence in what it contained. "Are you well?" he asked. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly. "The morning is difficult, but I am well." "You will tell me when you need help." "I will tell you when I need specific help," she corrected. "I will not be requiring supervision. I will be requiring the occasional assistance with heavy lifting and someone to be furious at when the morning is particularly unpleasant, which I'm afraid will be you." He laughed. "I accept both conditions." She told Thomas the following Sunday, and Thomas Bishop sat very still for a moment and then said, "Your mother would have been so glad." And that was the most he said on the subject for several weeks. But Irene noticed that his hands seemed to hurt him less on the days he came for dinner, which she thought might be connected, though she knew that was not how arthritis worked, and the connection was in something less clinical. The summer of 1894 was kind in the way that summers can be when you have done the work to prepare for them. Not easy, but fair. The rains came on a reasonable schedule. The cooperative well provided the supplement when they did not. The wheat grew tall and the corn grew faster than the previous year, and Irene, who was visibly pregnant through the summer, and who refused to modify her activities beyond the requirements of basic sense, drove the wagon and attended committee meetings and wrote 2 more letters to Commissioner Hayes about the cooperative's formal recognition by the territorial government. Hayes eventually agreed to everything. He had no choice, because the cooperative represented 230 farming families across 3 counties by then, and Irene Bishop Keller had the support of the Guthrie Daily Leader editor in a way that made political resistance to her proposals functionally untenable. She was not cruel about this power, but she was not sentimental about it either. In September, Helen MacDonald came down from Logan County for a month and stayed in the Bishop limestone house with Thomas, who found her company invigorating in the way of someone who is used to quiet and occasionally needs a great deal of noise. They talked farming and territorial politics and stories from before the land run, and Thomas Bishop's hands seemed to loosen on the days when the conversation was particularly engaging. And Helen MacDonald went home in October saying that Thomas Bishop was the most interesting man she had met in years. The baby came on the 23rd of October, 1894, and was a boy. They named him Thomas James Keller, the first name for his grandfather and the middle name for James Whitehorse, who had come to the farm in late September with a gift of carved wooden horses that he had made over the summer, and who had accepted the honor of the name with the same quiet dignity with which he received everything. Thomas James Keller arrived in the world with an opinion about it that he expressed loudly and at length, and Dr. Harrison said he was the most vigorous newborn he had seen in 6 months, and Arthur Keller sat in the chair beside the bed where Irene lay with the baby, and held his son's impossibly small hand, and looked at Irene with an expression that contained everything: gratitude, terror, love, awe, the specific vulnerability of a man who has something precious to lose and knows it. Irene, who was exhausted and triumphant and hurting in the way of recent childbirth, and also happier than she had believed, was actually available to people, looked at Arthur Keller and said, "He has your eyes." Arthur looked at the baby, who was currently demonstrating his opinion of the world with maximum efficiency. "He is going to be loudly opposed to everything he disagrees with," Arthur said. "He learned from his mother," Irene said. Thomas Bishop held his grandson for the first time the following morning, his swollen hands wrapped carefully around the small bundled weight, and said nothing for 2 full minutes, which was the longest silence Irene had ever heard her father keep. Then he looked up at her with eyes that were very bright and said, "This is worth everything," and Irene understood that he meant not just the baby but all of it, the run, the claim, the years of labor, the drought, everything. "Yes," she said, "it is." The cooperative celebrated its 2nd anniversary in the winter of 1894 with a dinner at the Colton church that Reverend Caldwell organized, and that became the first annual cooperative dinner, a tradition that would continue for decades. Helen MacDonald came down from Logan County again, which Thomas Bishop had known she would. Irene arrived with baby Thomas James bundled against the November cold, and the community that had organized around a water crisis and stayed together, because of what that crisis had revealed about what they could do when they acted collectively, gathered around her, and her husband and her baby and her father in a way that felt like something more than community. Felt like the answer to a question she had been asking since she was 11 years old, and her mother had died, and the world had contracted around her. Arthur stood beside her through the dinner with the specific ease of a man who has found his place, not just in the geographical sense, but in the deeper sense, who has found the person beside whom he makes the most sense. And Irene leaned against him slightly in a way that she had not done in any public space before, because she had not felt that kind of ease before, and he put his arm around her without making any particular thing of it. The winter passed and the spring came again, and the rhythm of their life established itself in the way that lives do when the essential question has been answered, and the work of building can begin in earnest. They planted again, and the cooperative expanded again, and Irene added 2 more members to the committee and wrote the charter for the cooperative's formal incorporation with the help of a lawyer in Guthrie, whom she had met through the editor of the Daily Leader. She also, in the spring of 1895, began teaching a class on cooperative agricultural management at the Colton Settlement House on Thursday evenings for any farmer who wanted to attend. The class was attended initially by women whose husbands could not see the point of such a thing, and then gradually by the husbands themselves, and by the end of the year, it had 18 regular attendees, including 3 young men from the newer settlements who had arrived with ambition and no inherited knowledge. James Whitehorse attended twice. He sat in the back and listened, and at the end of the 2nd session he said to Irene quietly that he thought she should write these methods down in a document and submit them to the Territorial Land Office, because in 40 years of watching settlers come to this land, he had never seen any of them organized with this particular combination of practicality and fairness, and the knowledge was worth preserving. Irene wrote the document. It ran to 37 pages. She titled it Notes on Cooperative Farming in Conditions of Drought and Shared Resource Management, and she sent copies to the Territorial Land Office in Guthrie, to the Kansas State Agricultural College, and to Commissioner Hayes, who by that point had given up on finding her operations anything other than impressive, and had begun attending cooperative meetings voluntarily. The document was eventually included in the territorial government's agricultural guidance materials. Irene's name was on it. In late 1895, Irene found herself expecting again, and she told Arthur in the same straightforward fashion as before, and Arthur's response was the same combination of joy and immediate practical concern, and she found this so consistently, characteristically himself, that it made her love him with a specific sharpness she had not expected love to have, the sharpness of knowing someone completely. The second child was a girl, born in July of 1896, and they named her Irene Ruth Keller Irene for no particular person, but because Irene had always liked the sound of it, and Ruth because the book of Ruth in the Bible had always seemed to Irene, since she first read it as a child, to be about loyalty of the specific active kind she most admired. Irene Ruth Keller arrived in the world without the vocal protest of her brother, and spent her first hour looking at everything with wide, contemplative dark eyes that Arthur said were exactly Irene's. And Irene looked at her daughter, and felt the same fierce, uncomplicated love she had for Thomas, and also something specific and additional, which was the sense of continuity, of a woman's life passing into another woman's life like the water passing through limestone, persistent and full of direction. Thomas Bishop, who was 63 now and whose hands troubled him less than they had, held his granddaughter and said her name twice, quietly, as though learning how it fit in his mouth. Irene Ruth, he said. Good solid names. She is going to be formidable, Arthur said. All the women in this family are formidable, Thomas said. It is a gift they give each other. Arthur looked at Irene, who was watching her father hold her daughter, and thought that Thomas Bishop was one of the wisest men he had ever known, and that he was very glad to be his son-in-law. The cooperative reached its 5th year in 1898 with 192 member families across Colton, Logan, and Kingfisher counties. The limestone aquifer network had been expanded and documented. The grain elevator in Colton had been partially purchased by the cooperative, which gave the member families direct control over the storage and grading of their grain, rather than being subject to the elevator owner's terms. The railroad rate negotiations had been formalized through the Territorial Agriculture Bureau, with the cooperative's combined volume providing the leverage that individual farms could never achieve alone. Commissioner Hayes had been replaced by a new commissioner who had been recommended partly on the basis of his relationship with the cooperative, which was a form of political influence that Irene Bishop Keller acknowledged privately to Arthur and declined to discuss publicly, because she thought that particular kind of power worked best when it was not examined too closely. Arthur had become, in these years, something he had not set out to be, but that fit him with the inevitability of the right tool finding the right task. He had become the practical anchor of the cooperative's operations, the man who managed the machinery, the drilling schedules, the elevator operations, the 10,000 concrete details that made Irene's organizational vision functional rather than merely ideal. He did this without claiming credit for it, which was not false modesty but genuine preference. He did not need the recognition. He needed the work to be done well, and he needed to know that Irene knew what he contributed, which she did and made clear in the particular way of their partnership, which was direct and specific and full of respect. He also, in 1898, expanded the Keller farm to 80 acres, which was twice what it had been when he arrived in the territory. Irene was on the deed as joint owner, which was not legally required, and which he had insisted on from the beginning of their marriage, because he had very clear ideas about the relationship between labor and ownership. Thomas James Keller, who was 4 years old, developed the opinion that farm equipment was the most interesting thing in the world, and spent large portions of his days following his father around the farm, with the focused attention of someone gathering information for a future career. Elena Ruth, who was 2, spent comparable portions of her days following her mother, and had already demonstrated a concerning aptitude for organizing the household's younger chickens into behavior patterns that served her purposes rather than the chickens. Thomas Bishop found both grandchildren endlessly entertaining and slightly frightening in the way that the young are frightening when you can see in them the combined best qualities of people you love, amplified and aimed forward at a future you will not entirely see. He died in the spring of 1899, on a Tuesday in April, of the pneumonia that came into the territory that winter and took several of the older settlers. He died in his bed in the limestone house, with Irene holding his hands, the swollen, beautiful, capable hands that had built the house and worked the land, and held her when she was 11 and her mother had died, and Arthur standing in the doorway of the room, and outside the cottonwood trees were budding in the first warm week of spring. Thomas Bishop's last clear words to Irene were, "You did everything I hoped and things I never imagined," and she held his hands and said, "You taught me everything," and both of these things were entirely true. The grief was enormous and also strangely uncomplicated, because Thomas Bishop had lived 86 years of good life by his own measure, and had seen the land he staked into something that would outlast him by generations, and the grief for such a death, while real and full and present, does not carry the weight of unfinished things. They buried him on the property, beneath the cottonwood trees near the springs he had loved, and James Whitehorse came to the burial and stood with them in the spring light, and afterward said something in Cherokee that Irene later learned, when she thought to ask, was a traditional phrase for someone who had belonged to the land. That spring they decided to expand the limestone house and make it the family's primary home, moving back to the Bishop property that was now the Keller property, because Irene needed to be on the land her father had claimed, and Arthur understood this without being told. The work of expanding the house went on through the summer of 1899 and into 1900, and it was the kind of project that organizes a family's days around something being built rather than just maintained. And young Thomas James was old enough by then to help carry stones and was very serious about it. And Elena Ruth developed the theory that she should be permitted to help regardless of the opinion of the adults, which was the most Irene thing possible in a 5-year-old. Irene was 45 years old when the century turned, and she was standing in the doorway of the expanded limestone house on the first morning of 1900 looking out at the Cimarron River Valley in the early light, and Arthur came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and they looked at the land together. "Where did you think you would be," he asked, "when you were 25 and riding into the territory for the first time?" She considered this for a long moment. "Here," she said. "I think I thought I would be here, not specifically this house, but this kind of here, with land that was mine and work that was mine," and she stopped. "I did not expect you," she said. "I did not expect that part. Is that a complaint?" She turned to look at him. He was 40 years old now, and the gray at his temples and the deeper lines of his face suited him in the way that time suits people who have been doing things worth doing. His eyes were still that complex gray-blue, still direct, still full of the specific quality she had first noticed in Pruitt's General Store 7 years ago. "You know it is not," she said. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth, gently and deliberately, the way he had done everything from the beginning, and she put her hand against his face and felt the morning stubble under her palm and thought about how completely he had become part of the texture of her life, the way limestone becomes part of the valley, not sitting on top of it but running through it, holding the water. In 1901 they had another child, which surprised them both, Irene being 36, and having assumed that the family was complete. The baby was a boy, born in May, small and dark-haired and loud, and they named him William Harrow Keller William for no particular ancestor, but because both Irene and Arthur liked it, and Harrow because the first piece of land Arthur had farmed in Oklahoma was the Harrow place, and that beginning deserved to be remembered. William Harrow Keller grew up with the cooperative as simply the way things were, the way the water table worked and the crops rotated, and the neighboring families cooperated and helped each other and organized around shared problems. He grew up thinking this was normal, which was, Irene thought, possibly the most important thing she had ever made normal for anyone. By 1905, the cooperative had been operating for 12 years and was one of the oldest and most successful farm cooperatives in the Oklahoma Territory. It had weathered 2 additional drought years, one locust season that reduced the kingfisher harvest by 40%, a dispute over water rights with a commercial land company that required a lawyer from Oklahoma City, and 3 months of the most detailed and precise letter-writing Irene had ever produced, and the ordinary slow attrition of some member families leaving the territory or selling their land and needing to be replaced by new members. Helen McDonald retired from the Logan County Committee in 1903, and her daughter took over the position, and Thomas Bishop, when Helen retired, wrote her a letter saying that she was the best organizer he had ever encountered in 3 counties, which delighted her so much that she quoted it to people for the rest of her life. This Thomas Bishop was not Irene's father but her son, who was 9 years old in 1903, and had already developed the habit of saying exactly the most useful thing in any situation, which was something he had been watching both his parents do his entire life. James Whitehorse died in 1904, at an age that Irene was not certain of because he had never spoken of it directly. She attended his burial on his daughter's land and brought her children, and she told them who James Whitehorse was and what he had known and what he had shared, and why they knew to drill to the limestone aquifer and not the surface wells, and she made sure they understood that this knowledge had been a gift and that gifts create obligations. "What kind of obligations?" Thomas James asked. He was 10 years old and took everything seriously. "The obligation to use the gift well," Irene said, "and to say clearly who gave it to you." Thomas James nodded and filed this away with the seriousness he gave to everything, and Alina Ruth, who was 8, said, "Is that why you always say his name when you talk about the cooperative?" "Yes," Irene said, "that is why." Arthur held her hand on the ride home from James Whitehorse's burial, and she let him, and the afternoon was cool, and the children were quiet in the back of the wagon, and the land around them was green in the way that late summer in Oklahoma is green when the water table is healthy and the rains have been reasonable. And Irene thought about all the people whose choices and knowledge and generosity had contributed to the green of it, seen and unseen, named and unnamed. In the October of 1905, the Colton County Farmers Cooperative held a dinner at the expanded Methodist Church to mark its 12th anniversary, and Irene Bishop Keller was given a citation by the Territorial Agriculture Department for her role in establishing cooperative farming practices in the Oklahoma Territory. She accepted the citation and said in her acceptance, which was brief and specific in her manner, that the citation should be understood as acknowledging the work of 236 farming families and one Cherokee man whose knowledge of the land was older than any of their claims, and that she was honored to have been the person who organized the letters. Commissioner Newberry, who had replaced the predecessor Hayes had recommended, said afterward that it was the most effective deflection of personal credit he had ever witnessed, and that he did not believe a word of it. Arthur was standing at the back of the room when she spoke, with William on his hip and Thomas James beside him, and Alina Ruth, already working her way through the refreshment table with the systematic approach she brought to all food-related challenges. And he watched his wife speak, and felt the same thing he had felt in 100 rooms over 12 years of marriage, which was the specific pride of knowing that the person who is being recognized is exactly who they appear to be. She found him afterward, when the speeches were done, and the music had started, and the children were occupied with other children, and the room had relaxed into celebration. She stood beside him and he gave her his arm, and they stood together watching their community celebrate itself, which is what communities need to do periodically to remember what they are. Happy? Arthur asked. She considered the question with the genuine seriousness she gave everything. Yes, she said, thoroughly and specifically happy. Good, he said. Are you? She asked. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her since the beginning, the full and direct and undefended way that had cracked her wall open the first time she had seen it completely. Every day, he said. Every day since I walked into Pruitt's store and you told me you managed the field work. You fell in love with me over a mention of field work, she said. I fell in love with the way you said it, he said. Like it was the most natural thing in the world and you could not imagine why it would be otherwise. Irene Bishop Keller looked at the man she had argued with and proved wrong and worked beside and married and built a family with. The man who had told her the harvest was already lost, and whom she had shown what was possible when you refused to accept the first verdict on something that mattered. And she thought that the story of them was not really a story of her proving him wrong. That was the surface of it. Underneath, it was a story about two people learning the same lesson at different speeds through different means, which was that the only true failures are the ones you choose by refusing to try. Come and dance with me, she said. He had never been a particularly skilled dancer, and this had been the subject of gentle discussion between them for 12 years, and he took her hand with the expression of a man who has accepted his limitations and decided they are manageable. And they danced together on the floor of the Methodist Church in Colton, Oklahoma Territory, in October of 1905, while their 3 children ranged through the room, and their community celebrated what 12 years of organized stubbornness had made possible. Outside the church, the Cimarron River moved in its banks toward the south, and the limestone aquifer ran beneath the valley in its ancient and reliable channel, and the fields that surrounded the settlement were resting in the patient way of harvested fields, spent but not finished, waiting for the spring. The harvest had been lost once in the summer of 1893, according to one man's assessment on a hot August afternoon. It had been found again through the organized determination of a woman who had refused to accept the finding, and through the partnership of that same man who had proved, in every year that followed, that the difference between surrender and survival is not always strength, but sometimes simply the willingness to change your mind when the right person shows you what you have missed. 3 counties of farming families thrived in their fields and in their cooperative, and in the accumulated knowledge of what they had done together. And Irene Bishop Keller continued to write letters and attend meetings and organize things that needed organizing. And Arthur Keller continued to fix the machinery and manage the details, and hold his wife's hand, and tell their children the story of the summer of 1893 whenever they asked. Thomas James Keller asked frequently, because he was the kind of person who needed to understand the origins of things to understand the things themselves. Eleanor Ruth asked occasionally, and each time she asked she heard a slightly different version, which she eventually realized was because her mother was not narrating history but actively thinking about it, which Eleanor Ruth decided was the most interesting thing a person could do. William Harrow Keller, the youngest, asked only once, when he was 7 years old, and his question was not about the drought or the wells or the cooperative but simply, "Were you scared, Mama?" Irene Bishop Keller looked at her youngest child and thought about August of 1893, and the barn and Arthur's face and the 7 letters she had written in the failing light and the 63 families in the church and the water rising in the Henderson well casing and the garnet ring on her finger and the harvest that had come in after all. "Yes," she said, "I was frightened." "But you did it anyway," William said. "That is what frightened means," Irene said. "It does not mean you stop." It means you have something worth protecting." William Harrow Keller nodded with the solemnity of a 7-year-old receiving a truth that is larger than he currently fully understands, but that he intends to keep until he does. Arthur Keller, who had been standing in the doorway and heard all of this, said nothing. There was nothing to add. His wife had said the exact right thing, as she generally did, and the evening was warm and the lamp was lit, and the children were fed and the land outside was theirs, jointly and specifically and in full. And the harvest that had once been declared already lost, had come in 30 times since then and would come in 30 times more. And everything that mattered in the world was contained in this limestone house beside the Cimarron River in the particular light of a Tuesday evening in October.